There is a specific kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with your body. It is not the tiredness of physical exertion or poor sleep or a long week. It lives somewhere behind your sternum. It shows up in the middle of the night when a conversation you had hours ago, a conversation that should have been nothing, is still cycling through your mind with no resolution in sight. You are replaying it, reconstructing it, searching it for the thing you should have said, or the place where you should have stopped, or the moment when you handed over something you cannot retrieve. You know this tiredness. The question is what to do about it. Arthur Schopenhauer spent the majority of his intellectual life on exactly this problem. Not the tiredness specifically, but its source, the recurring, almost mathematically reliable phenomenon of certain kinds of minds encountering each other, and one of them leaving the encounter diminished. He documented it without sentiment. He categorized it without apology. And the conclusion he reached, which made him deeply unpopular in his lifetime and permanently relevant in the centuries after it, was that the intelligent response to a certain category of person is not patience, not better argument, not persistent goodwill. It is withdrawal. This video is not about cynicism. It is not a prescription for isolation or an argument that other people are fundamentally worthless. It is an examination of a specific dynamic, one that Schopenhauer identified with unusual precision, and a practical guide to recognizing it early enough to make a real choice about how you respond. Schopenhauer's foundational observation was this: the capacity for honest self-reflection is not evenly distributed, and this has nothing to do with formal education, vocabulary, professional success, or social standing. He was describing something more interior, the specific psychological capacity to hold your own position loosely enough that new information can actually update it. The ability to genuinely entertain the possibility that you are wrong. The willingness to follow an argument wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. On one side of this line, people who can do that, who can say I was wrong and mean it, who can acknowledge contradiction without experiencing it as a threat to their survival, who can disagree without it becoming a war. On the other side, people for whom being wrong carries a cost that feels genuinely unbearable. Not people who are stupid, not people who are evil. People who have constructed, usually without conscious awareness, an elaborate internal architecture designed to ensure that they are never wrong, or if they are, never in a way that they have to acknowledge. Being wrong for these people is not an intellectual event. It is a psychological injury, and people protect themselves from psychological injury with the same tenacity that they protect themselves from physical pain. Schopenhauer did something remarkable in response to this observation. He cataloged the methods. He wrote with great specificity about the 38 rhetorical stratagems that minds of this type deploy, not through conscious calculation, but through psychological reflex. To avoid losing an argument, they have entered not to win understanding, but to win the exchange. He called this documentation the art of being right, which was ironic, because what he was actually describing was the art of never having to be wrong. Understanding these stratagems is not about gaining ammunition, it is about recognition. When you can see the pattern in the first 30 seconds of an exchange, you can make an actual choice about whether to continue. Most people never get this far. They engage first and recognize the pattern only after they are already exhausted by it. The first pattern to recognize is the one that moves fastest and costs the most. When your argument is answered not with a counter-argument, but with a characterization of you. You make a point, a real one, with actual reasoning behind it. And the response you receive has nothing to do with the point. It has to do with you. Your tone, your history, your suspected motivations, what this reveals about your character. The subject of the conversation shifts, without announcement, from the idea being discussed to the person who raised it. And the moment you find yourself saying, "That is not what I meant," or "I wasn't trying to," you have already lost the thread. You are no longer engaged in the conversation that began. You are engaged in a defense of yourself. And a person defending themselves is a person who has been successfully separated from their argument. Schopenhauer documented this as one of the most reliable of the 38 stratagems, precisely because it is so effective and so fast. The shift happens before the target has time to recognize it as a shift. By the time you notice you are defending your character rather than your position, you are already several moves behind. The second pattern is more elaborate and requires patience to recognize clearly. Your actual position is not engaged with. A different position, one you did not hold, one that is recognizably related to yours, but extended past the point of accuracy, is engaged with instead. You say something measured, you qualify it, you acknowledge its limits, and the response treats a significantly more extreme version of your position as though it is what you said. So you are saying that nobody should. According to this logic, everything is. This is what Schopenhauer described as extension, the deliberate or reflexive stretching of a position to a point where it becomes easy to defeat. The reason this is so exhausting to engage with is that every time you correct the distortion, "No, that is not what I said. What I actually said was," the conversation extends. You clarify. They extend again. You clarify again. The cycle continues until the original point is buried under several layers of misrepresentation and correction. And the person who misrepresented it can reasonably claim that you keep changing your position. Because from their perspective, shaped by their own distortions, you do. The third pattern targets specifically the people who are most intellectually careful. Epistemic humility, the honest acknowledgement of the limits of your own knowledge, is treated as a confession of ignorance. When you say, "I think," or "I'm not entirely certain," or "This is my understanding, but I could be missing something," you are being accurate. You are doing what careful thinking requires. And a certain kind of mind hears this as a crack in your armor. They do not experience the qualification as honesty. They experience it as weakness, because they themselves speak in absolutes, not because they have thought more carefully than you have, but because certainty feels like strength, and uncertainty feels like defeat. The person who speaks with qualifications sounds, to this kind of mind, like someone who has already half conceded the argument. Watch for the response that follows honest uncertainty. See, "You don't even really know," or "You're not sure yourself." It does not engage with the substance of what you said. It seizes on the form of how you said it, and uses the honesty of the qualifier to delegitimize everything around it. The fourth pattern is the one that is most clearly visible over time, rather than within a single exchange. Nothing is ever actually resolved. Positions don't land. Agreements don't hold. The moment you make a point that cannot be countered, the subject changes. When what seems like agreement is reached, a new grievance surfaces. When the new grievance is addressed, you are suddenly being too serious, or making too much of this, or the problem was always about something else entirely. Schopenhauer identified this as the behavioral signature of someone for whom the conflict is not a problem to be solved, but an environment to be maintained. These are people who do not argue in order to arrive somewhere. They argue because the arguing itself provides something, a feeling of engagement, of significance, of at least temporary dominance over someone else's attention and emotional state. The goal was never resolution. The goal was the condition of unresolved tension. And if you enter that condition expecting to reach the exit, you will walk in circles until you are too tired to continue. Once you can see these four patterns with reasonable clarity, your relationship to the conversations they occur in fundamentally changes. Not because you have better counter-arguments, because you have stopped trying to win a game whose rules were designed to ensure you cannot. Here is what Schopenhauer understood that most people resist accepting. Irrationality is not a temporary condition. It is not a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up. It is not a person who simply has not yet encountered the right argument. For a significant portion of the people you will encounter in your life, the cognitive patterns that make genuine dialogue impossible are not correctable through better dialogue. They are structural. They are the way that person's mind has organized itself in response to whatever it needed to survive. This recognition produces two possible responses. The first is despair. If you cannot change someone through argument, what is the point of argument? The second, which is the one Schopenhauer eventually settled into, and which is genuinely liberating if you can reach it, is relief. Because if irrationality is structural rather than situational, then your inability to resolve the conflict through better reasoning is not your failure. You were not supposed to be able to. The expectation itself was the problem. The failure was not in your argument. The failure was in the category of your approach. You were trying to use reason in a context where reason has no functional purchase. This is not a reflection of your intelligence or the quality of your thinking. It is a mismatch between tool and task. Expecting logic to land in a mind that has organized itself against logic is not persistence. It is the wrong tool, applied with increasing frustration, to a material it cannot work with. The shift this produces, when it genuinely lands, is enormous. You stop experiencing these conversations as battles you are losing, and start experiencing them as evidence. Evidence that tells you something important about who you are dealing with, and what category of engagement is available to you with this particular person. Evidence that you can act on. The second shift, which is harder to hold in the heat of a real moment, is this. What is being directed at you in these exchanges is not an assessment of your value. When someone responds to your carefully made point with contempt, with dismissal, with bad faith, that response is not a verdict about who you are. It is a manifestation of how that person's mind works when it encounters something it cannot process on honest terms. It is information about them. It is almost entirely unrelated to you. This sounds simple. It takes years to actually absorb, because the animal part of the human mind treats social hostility as meaningful data about your standing in the group. It has been designed by millions of years of social evolution to care deeply about how other members of the group perceive you. That response is automatic. What is not automatic is the capacity to step back from the automatic response and evaluate whether this particular source of social disapproval is one whose assessment you should be organizing your behavior around. Schopenhauer's position was unequivocal. Most of the time, it is not. Most of the contempt and dismissal that lands on you from people who have demonstrated they are not interested in honest exchange is noise. Meaningless noise that your nervous system is treating as signal because it has not yet learned to distinguish between the two. The practice of making that distinction, of learning to identify which sources of social feedback are worth incorporating and which should simply be observed and released, is one of the most valuable things you can build over a lifetime. The third shift is about silence. Western culture has trained most people to believe that not responding is a form of defeat, that to let something go unanswered is to concede the point, that the person who speaks last wins. Schopenhauer rejected this completely. He was famous, or notorious, depending on how you look at it, for simply leaving exchanges that were no longer worth having, for declining to respond to provocations that he had determined were beneath the quality of engagement he was willing to offer, for treating his own attention as a resource that he was responsible for not wasting. Silence, in this context, is not passive. It is the most active and most disciplined choice available to you in certain situations. It is the choice to not give someone the reaction they are trying to extract. It is the recognition that your engagement is a real thing of real value, and that offering it to someone who is demonstrably unable to reciprocate it honestly is not generosity. It is waste. There are specific practices that make the shift from understanding to behavior more achievable. The first is a simple pause before every response in a conversation that has the texture of the patterns described above. Not a dramatic pause, a functional one. Long enough to ask, is this person arguing to understand something or to establish that they have won? That question, asked before you open your mouth, changes what comes out of it. If the answer is to understand, if this is genuine disagreement between people who are both interested in finding something true, then engage fully. Real intellectual friction is valuable. It sharpens your thinking and theirs. Do not mistake Schopenhauer's philosophy for a reason to avoid all challenge. He himself was one of the most engaged and contentious thinkers of his era. If the answer is to win, if what you are facing is performance rather than inquiry, then everything you say from that point forward is functionally irrelevant to the outcome. The outcome was decided before you said anything. The only variable that remains under your control is how much of yourself you spend on the transaction. The second practice is a clean, prepared exit. You do not owe anyone an explanation for why you are ending a conversation. But having language ready makes the exit cleaner, less likely to escalate, less likely to produce the fumbling that prolongs the encounter past the point of usefulness. Phrases that work. I think we see this differently, and I'm comfortable leaving it there. I've heard your position. I don't think continuing will change either of ours. I'm going to stop here. None of these contain an apology. None of them contain an invitation for a counter-argument. Each of them is a complete sentence that closes the loop without aggression and without submission. The critical discipline is to say it once and then stop. The exit is the last word. If they push back on the exit itself, you do not respond to the push. The sentence stands. Every additional word you add to the exit reopens the negotiation. The third practice is what might be called the energy audit. At the end of any day when you are more tired than the circumstances seem to warrant, trace the drain. Not the physical effort, the other kind. Which conversations left you feeling smaller than when they started? Which interactions required you to perform, to manage your presentation, to carefully calibrate what you said, to justify your existence in the conversation in ways that felt fundamentally unnecessary? These are the locations of the leak. You do not have to act immediately on every leak, but naming them, tracking them, building an honest picture of where your attention and emotional investment are going. This is the work that makes the patterns visible. And once the patterns are visible, the choices become obvious. The action that follows does not require deliberation. You simply stop going to the place where the drain is. Schopenhauer chose, across most of his adult life, a degree of solitude that most people would find extreme. And it was interpreted, as it almost always is, as the behavior of a person who had failed at connection and built a philosophy to justify the failure. I think this reading misses something important. I think he had done the arithmetic with exceptional honesty, and he had reached a conclusion that most of us are too socially conditioned to accept. Not every person who crosses your path has earned access to your inner life. Not every conflict deserves a response. Not every conversation is worth finishing. This is not misanthropy. Misanthropy is a posture of generalized contempt. What Schopenhauer was describing, and what this video has been building toward, is something more precise than contempt. It is discernment. The careful, honest assessment of where the quality of engagement available justifies the investment of what you actually have to give. You have a finite amount of the thing that makes you you. Attention. The capacity for genuine thought. The quality of your own interior experience, undisturbed by noise that adds nothing. Every time you engage with someone who has already demonstrated through their behavior that honest exchange is not on offer. Every time you try to reach someone who has no interest in being reached, you spend some of that finite resource and you do not get it back. The philosophical case for stopping is not complicated. It does not require elaborate justification. It requires only that you take seriously what Schopenhauer took seriously, that the quality of your own mind, your own attention, your own inner life is not a luxury. It is the thing of most value that you possess, and it can be protected or it can be given away. But it cannot be given away and still kept. Stop where the engagement stops being honest, not with drama, not with a speech, not with a final point designed to land so perfectly that even the person who cannot receive it honestly will somehow feel its force. Just stop, quietly, completely, without guilt and without looking back. In the space that opens up, you will find what Schopenhauer spent his life trying to describe and protect. A quality of interior quiet that does not require anything from anyone. A clarity that belongs entirely to you. A steadiness that is not dependent on whether anyone outside you understands, or validates, or agrees. That is what you are protecting when you choose not to engage. Not your pride, not your argument. Something considerably more valuable than either.